I'm Stella Harris. I am a certified intimacy educator and sex coach based out of Portland. Some of you may have seen me. I usually do a few things at Reed a year, as well as other local universities, and sex ed for adults around town, and when travel is a thing, across the country and Canada. I have a book out all about communication. I have another sex ed book coming out early next year. So this is my full-time jam. So I'm very excited to be able to be with you now virtually. This is the first series I have done virtually for you all. So hopefully you can see me and you can see the slides. And again, y'all will have the link to this as well, so you don't have to hurriedly take any notes. You should have all of that. So here we are in week 2. We're going to talk about distanced and solo sexual activity. So these are things that I actually always think are incredibly valuable and are part of their curriculum that I teach at all times. But of course, in the time of COVID, they're becoming even more front and center. We even have health departments across the US suggesting these things. So I'm glad that they're getting a little bit more attention. So just here's a little bit of sort of housekeeping. So last week we talked a lot about working through our feelings and needs. We talked about setting boundaries, speaking up for ourselves, a bunch of communication techniques. There is a video of that, and it sounds like the link will be coming soon. So you can catch up on everything we talked about last week if any of that sounds interesting. Today we're going to talk about technology for maintaining connection at a distance. We're going to talk about sexting and video play and all the various apps. We're going to talk about fantasy exploration, and as well we're going to talk about thinking about masturbation as both self-love and self-care. What I'm not going to cover is anything about how to parse Reed's rules and guidelines. I have read through them all, as have you, so hopefully we're all on the same page about what Reed is recommending, but I am not the person to ask detailed questions to. And two, I don't have any additional information about COVID risk or safety beyond Reed's guidelines or what medical professionals have shared. I am not a doctor. And a little bit about what to expect next week. So this time we're talking about solo and distance play. Join us next Sunday and we'll be talking about risk mitigation, risk assessment, safer sex, including safer sex within COVID times, and negotiating all of that with other folks. So come on down next week if you want to come in for all of that. So as I mentioned, to my delight, health departments are actually kind of catching up with what a lot of sex educators have been saying for a very long time now. This adorable image that you see here is actually from the Oregon Health Authority, and we'll see a couple more images from them later in this talk and next week. So health departments across the country and in Canada have been doing things like recommending phone sex and sexting and web chat because they are realizing that people need connection under all conditions. Just telling people to stay away from each other indefinitely is not feasible. People need connection. And over the last 6 or 7 months, we have been finding all of the ways that people are figuring out how to maintain connection. And everyone has been flooding to various online platforms. It has been fascinating. As someone who works in this field, I have had journalist after journalist has reached out getting quotes about sexting. Suddenly all the articles, across the web are about how does it work? How do you do it? What are the rules? And so people have really been trying to figure this out. And it's not that sexting is new, of course, but suddenly there is a great deal more interest in it when it is becoming, for some, the only game in town, and just in general, a whole lot more popular. And for the folks who just came in, do feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature with any questions that you might have at any time. So in addition to the basic sex ed classes, I also teach classes about dating and online dating. And an interesting statistic that I just saw is since the start of quarantine, the dating app Bumble experienced an 84% increase in video call volume and longevity. So this just sort of shows, again, how many people are moving towards, more sexting, more video chat. And it's not even necessarily sexy chat that they're doing, but people using those features sort of in lieu of an immediate first date. People are still on all the apps. People want human connection. We're just sort of having to move to a little bit more of sort of Victorian dating standards where, we have to woo each other for a whole lot longer. And, people are having correspondences that could last for weeks or months before they meet up. Or maybe when they do meet up, it is, over a distanced picnic in the park. And while there are certainly a lot of ways that this can be incredibly frustrating and difficult to figure out, I think there are a lot of benefits as well. Being in this field, I've heard people complaining about the pace of dating and hookup culture. And now, while it is certainly not for a reason any of us would have chosen, we are kind of getting a hard reset and a way to sort of look at some of our needs and our interests and our values and figure out, is there a better way to do this? Do we actually want to slow down and get to know people a little bit better? So now we're having an opportunity to do that. And some of the conversations that we need to have with folks about our needs, about our boundaries, again, that is a conversation that's being more widely had. And also having to navigate COVID safety is a really excellent way to figure out whether people you're interacting with are liable to respect your boundaries and your needs. If you tell someone what you need and they're still pushing for things you're not comfortable with, well, then right there, if that's the way they're going to behave, that's the way they're going to behave about other things. So if you're talking to somebody on an app and they want to meet up and you say that you're not comfortable with that, and they push that boundary and say, oh, but, and why not, and how about this, then they're going to behave that way around other boundaries as well. So, when people show you who they are, it's important to believe them. So what about how sort of the dirty talk and the sexting works? A lot of people feel really awkward about this. A lot of people aren't sure how to initiate. And I think that the rules are very similar for in-person and online connections. You ask. This is going to be my answer kind of for everything. If you were in person with somebody and you wanted to kiss them, my advice would be that you ask them if you can kiss them. And if you were texting with somebody and you would like to move it in a sexy direction, my advice, again, is that you simply ask them, just like you would when you're in person. And just as I say, when it's about in person, I don't think that asking ruins the mood. I think it helps. It builds anticipation because you know what's coming next. If the answer is yes, it's something you get to be excited about. And again, it's one more way that both people or all the people involved, if it's a group chat, are able to show that they respect consent. And that sort of is creating a space where it's going to be safer to have those interactions. Modeling that behavior from the get-go creates sort of this container of how is this interaction going to go. So asking really starts setting people at ease, and it sets the tone that things are not going to be changed, things are not going to be leveled up without those check-ins, without that asking. So, how you would do the asking is a little different if it is, say, somebody who, is a brand new connection versus someone you've been talking to for a while versus someone you've sexted with before. But for example, something like, hey, I just took a sexy photo. Would you like to see it? And that way it is a flirtatious, sort of fun, sexy thing, even if their answer has to be, I would love to, but not right now. Because that way, when we're asking, we're checking in both about, do you want this thing at all? And do you want it right now? Because somebody could be in the middle of a class or doing some work. Maybe there are other people around. For folks who don't live on campus, maybe they live with other people. Maybe they're doing some sort of shared screen situation like this, and maybe they have their notifications turned on. I have heard from more than one friend of mine that they didn't realize that when they're sharing screen, the alerts come with that. Some people even have their settings such that you get a preview photo when someone sends you a photo. So I know there have been quite a few whoopses of people's colleagues seeing their sweeties in various states of undress. So there's all sorts of things that we are sort of bumbling along and learning about the technology as we go. So again, even if it's somebody you already have a sexy connection with, it's always a good idea to ask, is now a good time? Both sort of logistically for them, is it a good time? And also, are they in the mood at that moment? Because just like in-person sex, we are not all ready to go at all times. So that's a great way to sort of set the tone and see if somebody is interested right in that moment. And as with my example of sending a picture, it's also a really good idea to ask about each kind of engagement. So asking about sexting in general and specifically asking about photos, because some people might want to do chat, but maybe don't want to give or receive photos. Same thing with voice, not surprising people with video calls. I have gotten a handful of surprise video calls during quarantine, and this was not a thing I ever thought I would have to look out for. But I don't know about you, but I am not, my hair is not brushed at all times, it turns out, if I am just bumming around the house alone, and I'm not always ready for that kind of interaction. So just like in-person sex, again, defaulting to asking about everything before we do it. Before I switch to the next slide, does anybody have any sort of general questions about the things that I've said so far? Or has anybody had any faux pas with notifications or other tech-based shenanigans? Okay. So it's important to negotiate even your dirty talk. So whether it's video, whether it's text-based, however that's going to work, it's important to negotiate it just the way you would negotiate something in person. Thinking about what your language likes and dislikes. So this means everything from body part words. So this is a huge one that I talk to people about for in-person play, and it is just as important for text-based play. How graphic are you going to be? What do you call your various body parts? What does the other person call their various body parts? Do you want to include that level of detail at all? What about pet names or name calling? For a lot of folks, they're even sort of nervous about dirty talk in person, and sexting or any kind of long distance play. It can feel even more intimidating than dirty talk in person. When you are sexting, I think one of the great benefits of that is you have a little bit more time to think about what you're going to say. Of course, I'm a writer, and that is sort of my comfort zone. For other folks, I know that it feels more nerve-wracking because it sort of sits there on the screen forever for somebody to see, versus something that you say in the moment when you're face-to-face. There's all of the distractions of everything that's going on. How is there touching? What are you looking at? And it can sort of feel like whatever happened verbally sort of comes and goes. But when you are texting each other, again, that can feel a bit more permanent. For that reason, you might also want to think about, are you negotiating what platform you want to use? So we're going to keep talking about sort of the privacy and safety aspects, but do think about that in terms of also what apps you're choosing. So do you want to be doing this on an app that is encrypted? Do you want to be doing it on a platform where words or pictures disappear after a certain amount of time? If you're doing this with people who aren't already current contacts, do you want to be using, different screen names, different phone numbers? That's all stuff to think about, especially if you are doing this with new connections, folks that you're meeting online. Remember how big a digital footprint we all leave. So, if you were, talking to somebody on Tinder or Bumble or OkCupid, And, you know, a year ago, maybe you were going to plan an in-person date. Would you have been giving someone your home address, or would you be meeting somewhere in public? Again, when I teach the dating classes, I always suggest meeting in a public place first. So what is the digital equivalent of that? Maybe it's not giving out your phone number. You know, maybe you get a Google Voice number that's dedicated to this sort of thing. Or again, you use one of the many apps, chat-based apps that allows you a bit of anonymity. There's a ton out there. You can sort of research which your favorite is around that. But think about what does that look like? What sort of digital safety do you want to think about? Because we are not that hard to find. And think about what you are saying about yourself that can trace back to you. So are you saying that you're a student? Are you saying which school you're at? You know, if you live off campus, are you saying what part of town you're in? I think sometimes we don't realize how many clues we are actually giving to our whereabouts. And so that's something that you want to think about in the safety piece as well. Also, when we are negotiating, we negotiate limits for dirty talk and fantasy play the same way we would negotiate for in-person play. And this is something that actually comes up with coaching clients who come to see me, couples who come to see me. This often sort of becomes a sore point because one person will be launching into particular dirty topics that have become a sore point because it's something that one person maybe wants to do in real life and the other person doesn't. And that just turns it into something that isn't even fun to talk about anymore. So one of the things that's really important to establish when you're engaging in fantasy play or dirty talk or sexting is, are we creating this purely as a fantasy that we're going to share? Or are we meaning to explore this as something that we might do at some point? So some people use dirty talk or sexting as a way to negotiate an eventual real life encounter. One way that this has come up with clients of mine a lot is for things like going to play parties together, or trying a new kink together, or having a threesome together. Something that might be absolutely outside of the comfort zone of one of the people. But the other person introduces it as dirty talk. And again, as soon as it sounds like this is a request for something that happens in real life, or it sounds like it's the beginning of negotiating something you're going to actually do, that can take somebody out of the moment of the fantasy element and makes them feel like they need to start reestablishing their boundaries. And then the conversation ends up being something else entirely. So it is really helpful to just be very clear and say, I would like to have, you know, fantasy conversation about X, and the understanding is I just want this to be, you know, for the fun of the conversation. I'm not trying to negotiate this for something that we're really going to do. That doesn't mean you can never ever choose to do it, but that's not the intention of that conversation in that moment. It's also really important to think about how people like to be complimented. So how well do you know the person that you're chatting with? Do you know sort of what tender spots and sore spots there are? This is another one that has come up, you know, sort of everything from based on age groups and culture. The terms we use to compliment somebody are not always received as compliments. I was a guest on a podcast about this. A woman over 40 who was identifying as a cougar and was meeting younger men on apps to date. And they were saying things to her like, you know, talking about her being thick, or I think one of them said something about, you know, a fat ass, something like that. And the people saying it, they genuinely meant it in a complimentary way. They were sort of fetishizing and enjoying and were turned on by these things. But the language that they were using was not being received as complimentary to the person who was hearing it. She was feeling offended and self-conscious and uncomfortable. And it was immediately just this breakdown of the conversation because the terms being used were not a match. There was a mismatch, again, in the language being used. And so I think we don't always realize that not everyone uses the words that we do. I mean, we can all be theoretically speaking the same language, and in fact, not be speaking the same language at all. So it's really important that we stay on the same page about these things. You can ask somebody, you know, what do you like to be complimented on, and what don't you, and sort of what terms feel sexy to you and what feels flattering to you. Finding out what areas of sensitivity somebody has. And again, this might feel like a lot of work if you're just looking, you know, for some quick sexting. But all of this builds a lot of intimacy. It is a way to build connection. You're getting to know the person a lot better. And again, just like I say for in-person sex, you know, if you don't want to go to the trouble of having a safer sex talk and a getting to know you talk, that can sort of indicate what the quality of the connection and the quality of the sex is going to be. And I don't have anything against, you know, the occasional quickie, but there's a different kind of pleasure to be had when you take the time to sort of get to know someone, to build comfort, to build safety. And again, all of that is true even at a distance for video dates, for texting chats. There's all of these little details that are really going to make a difference. One of the areas that, again, people worry is that language can feel so infinite that it just feels like it is just too big to think about all of the things that are yeses and nos. So one really helpful thing that you can do is just create a couple of lists. You know, in the example of name calling, you know, if you want to do that kind of dirty talk, you can just say like these 3 things are a yes, and then everything else is a no. So there's not too much guesswork, but you have enough yeses that the person can improvise a little bit. Or sometimes you can broaden that a little bit and think about what class of things are on the table versus off. You know, you can compliment my intelligence, but not my appearance, something like that. If you just sort of want to avoid entire areas that could be sensitive or could be touchy subjects, but then still leave a lot of room for improvisation. So you want to think about also any whole topics that are off the table. So maybe you don't want to get into anything even remotely kinky. Maybe you don't want to talk about anything in person. Maybe you don't want to talk about anything that involves other people. Maybe there's certain sex acts that you don't want to talk about. All of that can be negotiated in advance. And all of that is going to ultimately make the conversations flow a lot more easily when you get there. Before I move to the next slide, how's everyone feeling about that? We have any questions about the negotiation piece for chats? All right, I will assume you are all set. So what about the finding inspiration? So this is something else that I hear from folks a lot, is they really like the idea of dirty talk, of sexting, of fantasy play, and they just have absolutely no idea where to start. And this can also be true for wanting to try new things in person and not knowing where to start. There are a lot of places that you can get ideas. So one of the things that can take a lot of the pressure off, and I think can be really nice to do audio-based, so old-fashioned phone calls, where it can be really sexy to be able to hear someone's voice, but without the video element, so you don't need to worry about your appearance and your lighting and your background. That can be a really nice middle ground where it feels immediate and it feels intimate, but it's not making you self-conscious. So one thing that can be really nice is reading erotica aloud, either in a particular call, all one direction, or taking turns. And that sort of does a couple of things. For one thing, it can be a really great way to find fantasy inspiration. So you can find sort of scenarios or topics that are hot that you want to play with in a more improvisational way another time. It's a great way to figure out what you might be interested in for yourself. But also it takes all of that pressure off, and it can take some of the self-consciousness away. If you're saying, okay, these are not my ideas, these are not my fantasies, it's all on this author, and I am just gonna read their words. And again, you'd still wanna have a negotiation about sort of broad strokes, what sort of topics or activities are not going to be hot or not gonna feel comfortable. But then within that, just dive into the story. Let somebody else do all the work of deciding what's going to be said and how that's going to sound. You can also describe, a dirty picture that you saw in a magazine or online somewhere, or even describing a scene from porn or a sex scene from a movie. But when you have some sort of basis, something that has sort of set the stage for you, that can take a lot of the pressure off. If this sort of thing doesn't come naturally, it can be really helpful to just like have your source material right there and have something there that you're working from. And again, all of these things are really great ways to do fantasy exploration on your own, because we are going to be talking about solo play as well. And all of these activities are just as useful for finding out your own interests, your own turn-ons, everything from looking at pictures to reading erotica. And when I say erotica, what I think is most useful for this is finding anthologies of short stories, specifically anthologies that are collections of multiple authors, because that way there's going to be a bunch of different styles, a bunch of different scenarios. People are going to use language in different ways, and there's more likely to be a couple of winners, versus if you get a novel and you end up not liking the author, the whole thing is a bust. But with short stories, there are so many different stories in each collection that there's bound to be at least a few things that you enjoy. And one way that I like to work with those, I always have some sort of little sticky notes or Post-its or something near me. And you can sort of color code. You could read through in advance and pick the ones that you want to read. You can put like green stickers by things that you really like, maybe red stickers by things that are a no-go. And in that way, you can sort of use it as a way to sort of build up a repertoire, whether it's for things that you do and don't want to talk about, or maybe it's for things that you do and don't want to try in person someday. Again, the other sort of potential upside to having to wait an extended period of time before engaging with somebody in person is you have more time to do all of this exploration. You have time to explore fantasies at length, to have a very complete negotiation without any of the things that sort of incentivized rushing through things. In the days of sort of meeting someone on Tinder and having them, maybe push to meet up the same day, a lot of conversations get rushed, a lot of things get missed in a scenario when we're waiting weeks or months to meet up with somebody. Everything can get discussed, everything can get negotiated. And again, rather than that sort of spoiling the fun, I think that it builds the anticipation. We have all of this time to think about it in a way that sort of heightens the arousal of that thing that ultimately maybe we get to do in person. Another way that you can get inspiration and learn some things about the people that you're talking to is ask about things that they've done. Ask someone, what's the hottest thing you ever saw? Tell me about something that you read that really caught your attention, or what was a really engaging experience that you had. And sharing stories back and forth like that about things that have sort of happened in your real life and have really stuck in your memory. Oftentimes we have source material like that from things that maybe have nothing to do with sex. There are scenes from movies that stand out to us that are not overtly sexual at all, but there's some element in there, something, maybe there was some power dynamic, something going on that really caught our eye and stuck with us. And when we have all this time at our disposal, we're able to sort of go back through our memories and find all those sort of little hidden clues that are available to us. So use that time. So there is a question in the Q&A about if I have any specific book recommendations. And I just happen to be sitting in front of an entire bookcase of recommendations. So yes, I'm full of opinions. All right, I will pull out a few of my favorites. Incidentally, these are ones that I have stories in, that's why they're so quick at hand. But I will tell you two of my favorite editors of erotica, Rachel Kramer Bussell and Allison Tyler. They have both done, edited tons and tons of anthologies. They're both lovely human beings who know what they're talking about and work with good authors. So anything that is edited by either of them. The other thing that, the reasons that I grabbed sort of these three, so the ones that I just grabbed are, one is called Sudden Sex, and it is edited by Allison Tyler. And not only is it short stories, but all three of these are short shorts. So the stories are maybe 1,000 words each. So same for Bondage Bites, which is also an Allison Tyler, and Big Book of Orgasms, which is one of the Rachel Kramer Bussell ones. So all three of these are the short shorts. And that way, again, it's just, 2 or 3 pages and you're in the next story. So it is really easy to, something really does it for you, great. You can find other things by that author. Something is not your cup of tea. You just flip a couple of pages and then you're on to something else entirely. There is another good one, Love Burns Bright. This one is specifically lesbian romance erotica. This one's edited by Radcliffe. They do a lot of queer erotica. The author and editor Sinclair Sexsmith also does a lot of collections of queer erotica that are fantastic. So those are some of my book opinions. I'm pretty sure on my website under, I think something called like Stella's Picks, I have some books listed there as well, and there's sex ed books as well as erotic books. So I could talk all day about books that I like. But yeah, some of those editors are going to be sort of a good place to start. I also wanted to sort of point out that the bar is actually kind of low for this stuff. So people are worried about getting everything just right, making everything perfect. And, advice that you may have heard that has certainly been said to me is that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Meaning if we have this sense of perfectionism, that can prevent us from ever starting. But what I know from folks is they can be so excited about the dirty talk, the sexting, getting to do it at all, but they aren't looking for perfect. People really just, they like hearing things out loud. They like reading them. They like that kind of engagement. And so there's not this high bar of perfection. If you're doing it on the phone or by video, you don't need to dress up in a particular way. You don't need to be doing a special voice. You can just use your normal voice. You can talk about, normal day-to-day activities. One of the things that was sort of talked about at the beginning of quarantine, people were saying it's not even necessarily the sex that they're missing. It's, it's the hugs and snuggles and hand holding. And I absolutely, I don't know what you would call snuggle texting, but when I went a couple of months without getting to see a sweetie, we were absolutely texting, I would hug you so hard right now. And again, maybe it sounds silly, but those are often the things that people are really longing to hear. And that is a totally valid thing to do. So if the hot and heavy sexting isn't for you, maybe you're talking about that really long snuggle that you would like to have. And sharing that kind of information is also a really great way to connect. And sometimes that's even harder. Sometimes the tender stuff feels more vulnerable or harder to share or harder to talk about. And then anytime we do something that is scary or vulnerable, that helps us build connection, that helps us build intimacy because we are getting through that scary thing together. So this image came from actually a Teen Vogue article about online safety, and I liked that a lot, so I figured I would share that with you. We talked a little bit about this, but you don't need me to tell you this is sort of a constant topic, but the internet is forever. And while these days, thankfully, there are a lot more laws protecting people's privacy, and there are laws protecting how people use each other's images. There are laws around what they call revenge porn. So if you share images or videos of somebody without their permission. But again, that the laws only sort of create punishments after the fact. They don't necessarily prevent the infractions from happening. So what I tell folks is, don't send anything to anybody if it would break your heart if it was everywhere. Of course, we care about and trust the people we would be thinking about sending nudes to. And also everything from technology failures where something ends up not being private to someone not being who that we thought they were and having them share something with friends or share something with the internet at large. It can happen. So do keep that in mind, and take your sexy selfies, bearing that in mind. So what does that look like? Well, for a lot of folks, that means things being sensual rather than explicit. So what does it look like if it's, just sort of a shoulder revealed? Again, sort of getting back to our sort of Victorian era courting, seeing some saucy ankle showing, images that maybe don't include a face or don't include, really recognizable tattoos. Think about what you are comfortable with. And also keep in mind some of the laws about this. If somebody is underage, even taking photos of themselves, even exchanging photos with other people of their own age is against the law. So do mind that. People have been prosecuted for, sharing sexy images of minors, even when they are that minor in question. So that does get a little dicey as well, if that applies to any of y'all. So just think about that. Anything that you're sending in the world, how would you feel if it turned up on the internet somewhere? In my line of work, I've sort of given up on privacy for myself, but that is a different consideration for everybody. So think about that carefully. What about what platforms you're going to feel comfortable with? So we talked a little before again about do you want to choose something that's encrypted, something like Signal or WhatsApp? Are you going to have a Google Voice number that is dedicated? Are you going to use something like, like Kik or like Snapchat? So think about what platform is going to be best for the sort of safety features that you're looking for, that you're interested in. Think about what your usernames are. For example, a lot of folks will meet people on Instagram. But depending how you use Instagram, it probably doesn't take a whole lot of scrolling to, maybe see pictures in front of your house and pictures of family and pictures of where you're at school. So how much of your personal information is already revealed? And even if you've just started talking to somebody, how much information can they have about you already? So think about that. Think about the context in which you're meeting somebody and how much information they have about you and how much control you have about what information is out there already. All right, so more of the sort of details when we're talking about sexting specifically as a form of dirty talk, but when we're doing it in a text-based way. And some of this, again, like viewing things as someone who's used to writing for print, there was some sort of growing pains for me getting used to sort of text speak. I have been told on more than one occasion that I sound angry because I use punctuation. I can't quite bring myself to not put periods at the end of my sentences, but I've now at least learned to, throw in the occasional smiley face to prove that I'm not in fact mad, even though I'm using complete sentences. But think about everything that is missed when you're texting, right? We don't have the tone of voice and we don't have the facial expressions. We're losing all of the nonverbal communication. We're losing all of the nuance. And that actually is a great time to add extra enthusiasm. So, use those exclamation points, use the emojis, do what you can, especially because engaging in that way is something that's vulnerable. We want to be positive. We want to give people Positive enforcement. And again, it's not writing for publication. You can use your adverbs loosely. You can say, I'm really this, or that picture is very, very that. It gets to be casual. It gets to be enthusiastic. No one's going to, edit it. No one's going to come through it with a red pen. Because doing this can be something that is so vulnerable for folks, we do want to have that positive reinforcement. So, agree with what people have said, tell them that something sounded really sexy, thank them for compliments. It's not about over the top ego stroking. It's just remembering that, if you look at your screen and smile, they don't know that. And, while you may think you have all this down, because you text everybody all the time, just keep in mind that when it turns sexy, the vulnerability is really ramped up. And so all of the little things are going to matter a lot more. People are going to sort of be on edge to see how what they have said is being taken. So we want to do what we can to make people feel good, especially if there are pictures. If you have both agreed about sending and receiving pictures, don't leave someone hanging if they send you a sexy picture. We want to thank people for it. We want to compliment them on something. That can be a really vulnerable and scary thing to do. Again, even if it's not graphic, even, just a regular old selfie of somebody's face, that can still feel like a really vulnerable thing to share. So we want to make sure that we are respecting people's vulnerability by being kind in response to that. Sometimes the element of not being face-to-face can make it easier. So while there are ways in which, there's information we're missing because we can't see each other, it can also sometimes make it a little bit less scary to sort of talk about a fantasy that we feel a little bit nervous about. Just again, remember that there is in fact a human being on the other side of that screen, and make sure we're doing check-ins. So just like you would if you were in person with somebody, we want to be doing check-ins as we go. Make sure that, somebody's still enjoying themselves, that they want to keep going, especially if somebody hasn't answered in a while or sort of doing one-word answers, or you're just getting like, you want to make sure that they're still fully engaged. So lots of check-ins back and forth, positive reinforcement, making sure everybody is on board with what's going on. So I'm going to transition into some solo play stuff, but now is a great time to let me know if you have any more sort of sexting specific questions. Okay. So what about pleasure in general? So maybe I don't have to tell you this, but when I'm talking about pleasure in this context, I'm talking about in the context of self-pleasure and exploring our own bodies. And as somebody who teaches intimacy, teaches pleasure for a living, I have seen the ways in which the way we relate to our bodies and the way we learn pleasure starts very young. And that can be, by the things that we have done or by the absence of those explorations. The patterns that we learn of relating to our own bodies last a lifetime. We learn how pleasure works, we learn how our bodies work, and we form relationships with our bodies. And this is actually one of the most valuable ways to change our relationships with our bodies. So all too often, the only way that we relate to our body is by how it looks. But that's very fickle. That's something that can sort of change at any time, isn't entirely under our control. It can be a lot more valuable to relate to our body based on what it can do for us and the ways it can make us feel. So, something like having a meditation practice or a yoga practice, how can your body feel when you're engaging in yoga? Are you seeing the way that your body can move? And the same thing with how it can feel with pleasure. Like, what does your body feel like when you're standing under a hot shower? Or, the wind is touching your skin? or you're digging your toes into sand at the beach. All of these, it doesn't even have to be about sex, but all of these sensual experiences our body allows us to feel and to experience. And all of these things are a form of pleasure. So as somebody who teaches about pleasure for a living, I do think that it's really valuable to have a very broad outlook about what pleasure means. It's not just about sexual pleasure. It's certainly not just about pleasure with other people. It's all of these forms of pleasure. And starting to think about what are the things that brings you pleasure, especially times right now that are so incredibly stressful and things are changing so fast. We're talking about things like self-care all the time, but what does that really mean? Do you know all of the things that bring you pleasure? So sort of one of my favorite tricks that I learned a while ago, and part of why I'm so often, walking around with my cup of hot tea, taking long hot showers, the feeling of physical warmth actually mimics a lot of the effects of emotional warmth. So if we are feeling lonely or sad, and we don't have a person or a dog or a cat nearby to snuggle, physical warmth actually goes a long way towards comforting us. I have in fact even been known to take a cup of tea into the shower with me, and to get both sensations at once. Is it the same thing? No. But it does go a long way towards meeting those needs. If we can sort of think about any need that we have as sort of like a jar that you're filling with loose change, and we'd like the jar to be all the way full, but we'll work with what we have. So maybe the cup of hot tea is a handful into the jar, and the shower is a handful into the jar, and then wrapping up in a nice blanket is another handful. So maybe I get 3/4 of the way full with things that I can do myself. Maybe snuggling with another person would get the jar all the way full, but when that's not an option, 3/4 of the way full is not bad. And so it's really helpful to have all of these sort of tools in our toolbox, knowing, how can we meet a variety of our own needs, so that when, we're feeling bad, we have a way to check in, like, okay, I'm having a rough day. What do I need? Sort of what are my self-soothing options? So again, for me, it's usually the various warm things. It's part of why I'm almost always pretending it's sweater weather, because that sort of warmth and comfort really works for me. So I also really think it's a good idea to keep lists, and we'll keep talking about this, but having a little journal. I pretty much always have a journal within reach of anywhere I might be sitting, keeping one in my purse. Having a list of things that are soothing or comforting or pleasurable. And as we were talking about before with fantasy exploration, keeping a journal, maybe just bullet points of, things you've heard about, things you thought about that you might want to try. Because whenever we're on the spot, if I've had a really crummy day, it's not going to immediately jump to my mind what I need. So it is helpful to, maybe I have a Post-it note on my bathroom mirror, and it's just like, hey, feeling bad? Drink a cup of tea. And then you don't need to think about it, because I think we're all a little bit low on executive function. So making these things really easy for us, having these little reminders all over the place, that can be really useful. So what are some of the things that we did learn from our early exploration? So for what some people learned from early exploration, maybe there wasn't any. So sometimes what we learn is that there's a lack of information, or what a lot of people learn is shame. Some people were brought up either explicitly or implicitly being told that we don't do these things. These aren't kinds of, exploring that are allowed. And so that is something that we carry with us for our lives. For other folks, oftentimes there is a combination of sort of lack of time and lack of privacy, which leads to early explorations with pleasure and masturbation are often both fast and quiet. So how does that serve us later on? When we have more time and more privacy, is that still the kind of encounter we want to have, whether it's with ourselves or with other people? There have been studies that have shown that people that make more noise during sexual activity are experiencing more pleasure. Of course, what they don't show is, if that's a correlation or causation. But the good news is that is a really easy variable to check. So of course, not everybody has all of the privacy that they would like, but it can be important to sort of carve out a little space and time for yourself. So what else? If anybody wants to chime in and be really vulnerable and sort of say, what did they learn? What did y'all learn from some of your early exploration? I certainly, I was lucky I had my own room as a child, but it didn't lock. And we often don't really think to give kids privacy. So what does it look like if you know that your door can be sort of thrown open at a moment's notice? There's a certain kind of sort of deep relaxation we get when we know we won't be interrupted, that many of us don't get early in life and maybe never get, depending what living situations are. Some people always live with a lot of folks around, and that sort of private time can be especially difficult to carve out or maintain. Okay, so here we are getting another one of these fabulous slides that I love from the Oregon Health Association. Again, you are your safest sex partner. So this is always true. This is true 100% of the time, and it is now sort of doubly true in COVID times. And I just love that state health departments are encouraging masturbation. This is something I think that we should be getting from day one in sex ed. And so I'm really, really glad that they're finally talking about it now. So what do we have images of here? Well, we have what I believe is very tastefully meant to be a phone that theoretically someone is looking at porn. Maybe they're chatting with another person. We have a bottle that I suspect is meant to be lube, a wand style vibrator, some fingers, and some sort of a masturbation sleeve that is sort of in the neighborhood of a fleshlight. So these are all certainly good places to start. Sex toys are a fabulous way to play with ourselves and with other people. And also, they are not necessary. Our hands can take us an awfully long way, but if you have toys around, that can be a great option. Locally in Portland, Shebop is a great place to discover sex toys, and they have a great website. You can look at all of their stuff online. They do ship things, and they do curbside pickup, depending on what your transportation situation is. So this process of self-discovery, we want to kind of start from scratch, because we may well have picked up patterns that don't serve us super well. So like I said, maybe we did pick up elements of shame. Maybe we picked up this idea that we need to be fast and quiet. So what would happen if we started completely from scratch to figure out, what does our body enjoy? What do we like? Everyone's turn-ons are completely unique. So one of the ways I think it can be really valuable to explore is it sort of in a space or time that you would already be undressed or already be touching yourself. So if it feels like kind of a stretch to, dive into, spreading out on your bed and exploring genital touch, what about in the bath or in the shower? And again, people have limited amounts of privacy in bathrooms, but you should have at least a little bit. So what would it look like if you just do what you would normally do to clean yourself, but pay a little bit more attention? What kind of touch does your arm like? Does it like a tight squeeze or a light stroke? Does it like fingertips or fingernails? And you can do that sort of inventory for everywhere on your body, tip to toe. What level of pressure? What style of touch? What areas of the body are more interested in touch and which areas are less interested? What's more sensitive and less sensitive? And this can be a really great one to do as a journaling project as well, because it's not like you just explore your body once and then you know how it works forever. Not only does it change over time as we age, but it changes day to day, hour to hour, based on things like how much we've slept and how much stress we're under, and if we've eaten recently, and what time of the month it is, and there's all of these factors. So it can be really nice anytime you're going to try to engage in pleasure with yourself or with others to do a quick check-in, sort of touch yourself a little bit and say like, okay, is this an especially tender day, or is this a day where I want a little bit more pressure? And sort of see what's going on. And if you do keep that journal, you can learn what factors are influencing what you like. The way I think is especially useful to do this is on a journal page to do 2 columns. So on one side, you can have sort of what's going on, and on the other side, you can have what you're feeling. So, on this column A, I could say like, okay, I didn't sleep very well last night. And then on column B, I can see like, and I'm noticing today, I really want a more gentle touch. Or on column A, it could be, I just went for a really great run. And then on column B, realizing like, I'm feeling more high energy and I want, more vigorous activity. And again, you can just sort of do this over time, and then you can track patterns. So maybe every time you sleep badly, you want more gentle touch, or maybe when you're stressed out, you want tighter squeezes. Again, who knows what the patterns are going to be, but if you track it over time, you can sort of find those things. And just like I've learned to, when in doubt, have a cup of tea, you can sort of know what your default self-soothing mode is going to be, so that in the moment where you need that extra care, you don't have to do too much thinking about it. You have the notes already, sort of letting you know what's going to work. And again, not everything has to be about genital touch. Not everything has to be about seeking orgasm. What would it look like to just, give yourself a hug or engage in some self-massage? I mean, that's another thing I catch myself doing throughout the day, because I'm always hunched over a laptop with terrible posture. So what happens if you just sort of squeeze your own neck or shoulders? Your body can't tell. It's actually kind of amazing that, this sort of thing is so effective, but your body doesn't know. If your shoulder needs to get squeezed, it doesn't matter if it's your hand or somebody else's hand that's doing the squeezing. So try to be as kind to yourself as you would be to another person. Look in a mirror and say nice things about yourself. Give yourself positive affirmations. If it's something that you're comfortable with, try undressing yourself in front of a mirror, maybe do it slowly, and look at the different parts of your body and see if you can say something nice about every part of yourself. When we talk about what we learned from early exploration, a huge percentage of people's self-talk is negative. We beat ourselves up all the time. And it can be really great to consciously rewrite some of that by giving ourselves some positive affirmations. And this is another thing they have done studies on. Even if you feel absolutely ridiculous while you're doing it, it still works. So saying the nice thing, it has a positive effect, even if you think it's silly. So it doesn't matter if you feel goofy, it doesn't matter if you giggle about it, it still works. Just like the, doing the superhero pose, in fact, builds up confidence, even if you feel silly when you're doing it. So think about that. Think about how are you talking to yourself, and what effect is that having? Because language is incredibly powerful, whether we're speaking it out loud or thinking it in our head. We're sort of casting spells with our words, and do we want them to be ones that are building us up or tearing us down? And now that we've had this conversation, you're going to catch yourself the next time, you walk by a mirror and think something mean about yourself. There's going to be the little Stella on your shoulder saying to be nice. So see if we can sort of rewrite some of those patterns for ourselves. So we want to sort of run that whole inventory. And again, if you're a nerd like me, you can take notes in your journal, what areas like to be touched. And again, thinking beyond any sort of typical erogenous zones. Don't leave anything out, fingers, toes, ears, all of it. Pleasure can be had everywhere. It doesn't just have to be sort of bathing suit areas. Every part of us can experience pleasure. So we can even draw, like maybe if you're keeping the journal notes, sort of draw the little like gingerbread person outline, no artistic ability needed, and sort of take notes. Maybe you like draw little arrows and say, okay, yeah, this area liked touch a lot, this area not so much, this area wanted sort of heavy contact, this area wanted to be more gentle. You know, when we talked about, you know, taking sexy pictures maybe for somebody else, what would it look like if you took a photo that was just for you? And again, it doesn't have to be explicit. It doesn't need to be nude. But sometimes taking a photo can show us angles of ourselves we never considered. So if you ever just tried taking a picture sort of from a flattering angle with good lighting, that is only for your eyes to sort of change the way you see yourself. Again, anything you would do for another person, you can do for yourself for your own pleasure. So those are all some things to think about. And it is important to create time and space for these things. Again, even if you have physical space, you know, you have a room on campus or you have a bedroom at home or in a shared housing somewhere, that's not really the same thing as creating space. We all get very, very busy, and it's really important, just like you, again, might set a date night with another person. What does it look like if you set a date night with yourself? Actually setting time for self-care or for pleasure exploration, and put an actual thing in your calendar. Make sure it happens. A friend of mine has a great way of doing this where she has sort of date night with herself in her calendar. And some weeks it has to move because something came up, but her rule to herself is it has to stay there every week. So if she sets it for Wednesday and then has a work thing, maybe it moves to Tuesday, but it never gets erased. So what would it look like if you were actually making dedicated time to think about pleasure? And again, maybe sometimes pleasure means you're in a blanket and you have a cup of tea and you're reading a book. And maybe sometimes it does mean masturbation. But pleasure is essential. It's essential to our well-being. It's essential to our brain function. So actually making sure that that sort of me time is non-negotiable. And so that can mean non-negotiable with yourself. Again, you're not writing it out of your calendar. And if you do share space with other people, sometimes this is a negotiation that needs to happen. You know, if you share a bedroom with somebody, what does it look like to say, all right, you know, I need 2 hours a week and this space is just for me. And then on the flip side, they get that time as well. But making sure that we are sort of making those things a priority and not something we just sort of squeeze in here and there when we get a chance. And, you know, for anyone who does have sex partners with other folks, masturbation fulfills different needs than partnered sex. So this is something I've been asked on college campuses. I've had people ask me if I think masturbation is cheating. I've had this come up even with married couples. We have this idea, a couple of sort of faulty ideas. One is the idea that sort of the sexual energy is a finite resource. And if we use it up on ourselves, we won't have any for, you know, other partners, other people. But that's not how it works. It's not the sort of finite thing that we run out of. It actually operates a lot more like a muscle. So, you know, we're working it out, we're strengthening it. And that just means we have more overall. So the more often we get aroused, the more often we experience pleasure, the more often we will be able to do those things, and the more easily we will be able to do those things. So we're not sort of wasting or ruining anything. It is sort of an infinite resource that we can make sure that there's more of. And also nobody else owns our body, owns our sexuality, our sensuality. We don't owe that to anybody. So I think it's really important that this is something that is for us first and foremost, and then we can share with other people if we want to, but nobody sort of, we're not obligated to anybody in those ways. So that's what I have to say about that. The next couple of slides, I'm going to get into some of the sort of nitty-gritty. I'm going to teach sort of the very quick and dirty sort of anatomy lessons and touch techniques. So if you have questions about the negotiating and the talky bits, anything that we've talked about so far, now would be a really great time. I'm just going to grab my little demo models while you think about that. All right, looks like we're all set. Okay, so we're going to get some very, very quick anatomy. So of course I teach entire 2-hour classes about, various different forms of anatomy. And so now we're getting sort of the 10-minute version all thrown together. But here's a really quick overview I wanted to give you. So the really tricky thing about teaching anatomy is that absolutely everybody is different. So it is really tricky to sort of show one diagram. Because this is not going to be exactly what your body looks like, and this is not going to be exactly what your partner's bodies look like. There is an enormous amount of variation from person to person, and that's why a lot of the self-exploration I was talking about before is so incredibly vital, because the way your body works is going to be unique to you, and you're going to need to figure that out. But let's get you sort of in the general loose neighborhood. So for folks who have vulvas or something that is closer to vulvas on the spectrum, this is sort of the, again, very, very general cartoonified version of what you might be working with. And again, I'm not doing all of the internal anatomy because that is its own class, but I'll sort of show you my quick little diagram here. This is the clitoral complex. And so this sort of maps underneath what you're seeing on the slide there. So in my fleshlight example here, this sort of maps to right here underneath the skin. So what we're looking at here on the diagram is we have sort of the head of the clit sort of works as a good "you are here." So as on our diagram here, the clitoral glands, and then the clitoral hood. So regardless of sex or gender, people are more alike than different. We all start from the same stuff. And there's all sorts of pleasure to be had from all of these areas. Again, you just sort of need to figure out exactly how your body works and where you get the most pleasure. And so the clitoral hood here, all that extra skin tissue, is analogous to foreskin on somebody with a penis. And so that skin is there for a reason. Sometimes you might see in porn, people sort of moving all of the skin out of the way to have really direct contact on the head of the clit. For most people, that is way too intense. That's way too much. So the skin is there for a reason, just like foreskin is there for a reason. It's helping protect really sensitive areas. So you want to work with it, not against it. We're also seeing the inner and outer labia. Again, if you had sex ed sort of in high school, you might have gotten the labia minora, labia majora as the titles, and that sort of implies that one set is larger than the other. Again, in actual humans, there's tons of variation, and it's totally normal however everything is laid out. Basically, the way to think about it is if nothing is causing pain or distress, then it is perfectly fine the way it is. There's just a whole lot of cosmetic variation. So the urethral opening and then the vaginal opening. So this is one that I get questions about. Yes, the urethral opening, it's a separate hole from the vaginal opening. So a few more questions that I often get. People have questions about the hymen. This is something that there's a ton of misconceptions about in pop culture. The hymen is not a solid wall of tissue. It is sort of some tissue that is around the opening of the vaginal canal that stretches over time. So when we talk about tearing or breaking a hymen, that happens when something is too rough, too fast, not enough lube. There doesn't need to be any pain there. Basically, nothing's ever supposed to hurt. Pain is our body's way of telling us that some kind of harm is being done. So if you're engaging in something and it hurts, that means that something not great for you is going on. So that means that you want to slow way down, you want to do something slower, be using something smaller, you want to be using more lube. Again, the exact troubleshooting depends on the activity, but no sexual activity is supposed to hurt. That includes anal sex, that includes deep throating, like even stuff that looks sort of extreme is not supposed to hurt, doesn't have to hurt, in fact, can be pleasurable. There are just ways that we need to do it that are friendly to our bodies. So pain is your body's way of telling you that something is not quite right. Now, some people like to consensually play with pain, something like a spanking. Again, if we're talking about kink, that's something different entirely, and that's a conversation for another day. But when we're talking about sort of ways that we're using our bodies, especially around penetration, there shouldn't be any pain there. So pain is a signal from your body. That's something to listen to. So what we want to do if we're playing with a vulva and thinking about how to sort of do pleasure mapping, we want to see if we can sort of unload all of our misconceptions about like how it's supposed to work and explore everything. So using very, very clean hands with tidy fingernails, or better yet, even gloved hands, using some lube. A high quality water-based lube is my general favorite, something like Sliquid. Explore everything. So forget everything that you know about, where pleasure come from, and explore the whole area, basically engaging in sort of a full vulva massage. Using sort of thumbs the way you would rub someone's neck, and sort of what does it feel like to rub the inner or outer labia? What does it look like to rub circles around the head of the clit? What about the vaginal opening? Like, is there pleasure there? Do you want to play with penetration? Do you want to look for G-spot sensation? Again, this is a whole separate class. The G-spot is a bit of a misnomer. What we're calling the G-spot is really the engorged portion of the urethral sponge. A more accurate way to think about it is the CUV complex. So the clitoro-urethral vaginal complex, all of these different areas of the anatomy work together to form and build pleasure. But sort of the quickie takeaway from this is just there are places to find pleasure all over. And so it's really helpful to explore. So if you're exploring penetration, you can sort of try exploring like the face of a clock. So, about half an inch in, what does the face of the clock feel like? What about an inch? What about 2 inches? And again, just like we were talking about when we're exploring our whole body, how is it different at different times of day? How is it different when we're relaxed versus when we're stressed out? And when it comes to exploring certain areas of the genitals, especially something like a G-spot, it's going to feel different when we're aroused versus when we're not. Because the G-spot is something that we feel when it's engorged. That's something that happens with arousal. And so there's not really anything to feel there when we're not aroused. Also, for people of all genders and all genitals, physical arousal and mental arousal do not always go hand in hand. So there's something called arousal non-concordance, which is just basically any time our brains and our genitals don't agree. So we can be super interested in sex, but our genitals maybe are not getting wet or are not getting hard, and vice versa. Our genitals can get wet or get hard when we are not at all aroused, not at all interested in sex. So when we're by ourselves, we need to, again, listen to the brains, not the genitals. And when we're with somebody else, we have to listen to what the person is saying. We can't just look to somebody's genital response as an indication of interest or arousal or consent, because the two are just not always on the same page. In fact, there's a pretty high percentage of the time that they are not necessarily on the same page. So we have to believe the brains. So I'm going to now, so again, super quick, all of the sort of disclaimers about variety are true here as well. And so this is sort of one way where we, sort of mainstream sexual information is very gendered in a way that does everybody a disservice. And, it's usually just focused on cis folks, but we act like, what men want sexually is very simple and women are super complicated. And same thing with genitals. We act like vulvas are mysterious and complicated and penises are super simple. And all of that is ridiculous. Like I said, everybody of all genders and all genitals, we are more alike than different. And also from person to person, there's a ton of variation. So just like vulvas, penises tons and tons and tons of variation. So a few things to think about. For one, it's whether or not there is a foreskin. If somebody has been circumcised, the area that you see sort of on our diagram here, the frenulum, that is the area either where the foreskin is attached or where there might be a little bit of scar tissue if there was a circumcision. In either case, that on a lot of people is an area that's particularly sensitive. If people do have a foreskin, it comes down to protect the head of the penis when the penis is not erect, and when there's an erection, it sort of slides down. So erect penises look a bit more similar to each other when they're circumcised or not versus a flaccid penis. So if somebody has a foreskin, it is protecting the head of their penis, say from rubbing up against underwear throughout the day. And if they don't, there can be sort of more friction. And I sort of emphasize that because there can be different levels of sensitivity based on the level of protection that these sensitive areas are getting. So that's one of the many ways that people are different, and you sort of need to explore your own body. And if and when you're playing with another person, you need to check in with them specifically about what their body likes. Because even if you have the same parts, or if you've had partners with those parts before, there's no guarantee that what you think, what you like or what somebody else has liked is going to be what this person likes. We always need to talk to the person in front of us. There tend to be a lot of misconceptions that there's a lot of friction and a lot of pressure and a lot of fast movement. And that is absolutely not necessarily true. One of the things that folks, when we talked about that early exploration, a lot of times folks don't have access to lube early on. I remember I had some unfortunate run-ins with sort of hand lotion when I was younger, which is not a good substitute for lube. But a lot of folks, especially folks with penises, if they are used to masturbating without any lubrication, they can get used to a lot of friction. So it can be really nice to explore with some proper lube, something that is intended to be lube, something that's body safe, because there's a more range of sensation that's available when you're playing with lube, when you don't have that sort of intense friction. If there is a foreskin, like I said, with sort of the skin around the clit, the foreskin can sort of work a little bit as a masturbation sleeve and so can provide some protection, but even then some lube is a really nice addition. So exploring with all of those different sensations. And if playing with somebody else is something that you want to do, again, regardless of genders or genitals, it can be valuable to practice under the conditions which you would like to perform. So just like theater, right? You do a dress rehearsal in the costumes and with the lights on, so you know what it's going to be like when you have an audience. Same thing for masturbation. So a lot of folks learn to masturbate early on in ways that are maybe not analogous to how we're going to have partnered play. So a lot of people first learn to masturbate maybe by like humping a pillow or humping a mattress, which is fantastic. And that's a great way to experience pleasure. And also those sensations do not really closely mirror the sensation of another human being's genitals or mouth. And so sometimes that can create some difficulties. So if you are trying to get used to the kinds of sensations that you might experience with another person, you can start getting used to those by yourself. So for example, for somebody with a penis, if you have been masturbating with a hand and no lube and you're used to a lot of friction, you can try, say, using lube and a slightly softer grip, and that is more closely going to replicate another person's genitals of choice, orifice of choice, mouth, because that sort of dry friction is something we don't get as much from somebody else's body. So again, trying all these different forms of pleasure and seeing if we can explore new things. Whenever we are trying to explore something new, it's really helpful to couple it with something that we already know feels good. So for example, for someone with a vulva and vagina, if you're exploring G-spot play and that's new, but you already know external touch feels really good, doing both at once. And same thing with somebody for a penis. If you're trying exploring with less pressure, melding that with more pressure as well. So doing a few strokes with more pressure, the way that you're used to, and then a few strokes with less pressure, and melding the two together. And we're sort of training our bodies, hey, this other thing is something that can be pleasurable too. And sort of through these sort of self-explorations, we can train our bodies to enjoy a whole wide variety of sensations if that's something we would like to do. But there are so many things that can feel good. Why not have a way to explore them all? And in terms of internal play, again, for folks with prostates, again, just like with looking for a G-spot, we want to use very clean hands, very tidy fingernails, ideally using gloves, because the membranous tissues are really sensitive. But there are ways in which the prostate and G-spot are sort of analogous, except the prostate is its own discrete organ. But similarly, we're going to find it on the anterior wall. So for exploring on our own bodies, it's going to be inside on the anterior wall, roughly 2 inches in. And again, this is a whole 2-hour class specifically about prostate play, but it is an area of great pleasure and is worth doing a bit of exploration around if that's something you're comfortable with. Although I've already advocated lube for basically everything, it is 100% necessary for any kind of anal play. That area is under no circumstances self-lubricating, and those tissues are really sensitive. So we always, always, always want to be using some body-safe lube if we're doing any kind of anal play, again, regardless of gender. Everybody has an anus. They all need lube when they are being played with. Okay, that was an awful lot of talking, but I see that we only have 5 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that if there are any lingering questions that we get to those. I want to give you my contact info here. So if you didn't have a chance or didn't feel like speaking up while there were other people around, or if you're watching the video of this later, please do not hesitate to shoot me an email at any time. Just let me know you're in this class and you have a question. I'm also on Instagram if you want to message me there, or check out my website. I do have a book about communication stuff if you're interested in that. But I'm happy to be here as a resource for you about anything and everything to do with sex and bodies and relationships. So let me know if you think something is in my wheelhouse, and if not, I might at least know to point you in the right direction. And also we will be here again next week with more about sex with other people and more about risk mitigation and figuring out our own comfort zones. And if there's anything you know you want to hear next week, you can also let me know that by email. So feel free to let me know. And I think that there will be an eval form coming out as well where you could give that feedback. So I will definitely hover for a couple more minutes in case anybody decides they have a question. But that was the abbreviated, I feel like I was talking very fast, marathon of an awful lot of information I wanted y'all to get. And perfect timing, I'm just about done with my tea here. Yeah, everyone's all set? Okay, well, I hope I will see some of you again next week.
Right. Stella, I'm going to go ahead and leave. There's one person left, and I'll give them a chance to ask a question. So thank you again so much. Really appreciate your time, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.
My pleasure. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
All right, I'll give the remaining person just a moment if there's anything you'd like to say, and then I will pop out of here in about a minute. All right, I'm going to pop out of here. Hopefully I will see you next week.